Montana Territory, 1883, the wind tore across the high plains like it meant to rip the past clean off a person. Della James stood on the porch of the old family homestead, her hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The roof needed mending. The barn door leaned like a drunk. And the fields hadn't yielded more than a few pitiful sacks of grain last season. But that wasn't what made her jaw tense. It was what Mrs. Albright had said at the mercantile that morning, loud enough for every widow and ranch hand to hear. Della ought to stop dreaming. She's too old to marry now. Della was 36, not ancient. But in a town like Bristle Creek, where girls married at 17 and had 3 children before their 20th birthday, she might as well have been dust. She sipped the bitter coffee and stared across the dry field toward the distant hills, the same hills her husband died on 5 winters ago. A fever had taken him in 2 days. Left her with a tiny farm, 2 hungry children, and a heart so hollow she sometimes wondered if it still beat. The front door creaked. Her daughter Zadie stepped out barefoot, her dark braid hanging down her back. At 12, she was all elbows and questions. "Ma, there's a man riding up the trail." Della squinted against the sun. Sure enough, a lone rider was coming slow, hat tipped low, dust rising around his horse's legs. "Get inside," Della said. Zadie backed up, but not before whispering, "He looks like a cowboy." Della's stomach knotted. Cowboys meant trouble more often than not. She set her mug down, grabbed the shotgun from just inside the door and rested it against her hip by the time the rider reached the yard. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his boots dusty, his shirt half unbuttoned from the ride. He looked to be in his 40s, face sun-worn, eyes steady. He tipped his hat. "Name's Elias Rourke," he said. "Looking for work, heard you might need help." Della raised a brow. "You heard wrong." His lip tugged up just a little, not quite a smile. "You sure? I can mend fences, break a wild horse, clean out a well." "Not picky. I do not have money to pay. I am not asking for much, just a place to sleep, some bread and coffee, maybe a roof that does not leak." The way he said it made her pause. He was not slick, not sweet-talking, just plain-spoken. She looked at his hands, calloused, real work hands. She lowered the shotgun. "Barn's got space," she said. "You can stay 2 nights, that is all I promise." Elias nodded once. "Fair enough." He dismounted without another word, leading his horse toward the barn. Zadie peered out from behind the curtain, eyes wide. That night, Della lay in bed listening to the wind howl through the eaves. She wondered what kind of man rode into a stranger's yard offering work for nothing. She was not used to being offered anything, not since Caleb died. By morning, Elias had already cleaned out the barn, patched the chicken coop, and was boiling water by the well. Zadie followed him like a pup. Even her younger son, Zeke, peeked out more than usual from behind her skirts. By the second day, Elias had mended half the fence line and started chopping firewood. He was quiet, always working, always watching, but not in a way that made her uneasy. More like he was trying to understand the place, not judge it. That evening, Della brought him a plate of stew and a piece of cornbread. She found him on the porch, his boots off, one arm draped over the back of the bench. "You do not have to keep working like that," she said, handing him the plate. "I do not like to sit still." She sat beside him, careful to keep a space between them. The sunset bled across the sky, orange and soft. "I buried my husband out past the cottonwoods," she said suddenly. She had not meant to say it, but it came out anyway. Elias looked at her, nothing in his eyes but quiet. "I was 25. We had 2 babies. The farm was smaller then, but Caleb had plans. He always had plans." Elias nodded slowly. "I lost a brother to fever, hit like lightning." They sat in silence for a while. "The kind that did not press or demand. You planning to move on?" she asked after a while. "Wasn't planning anything, just riding. Running from something, maybe riding toward something. I will know when I find it." She looked down at her hands. They were rough, red from washing and work. No man had held them in over a decade. "You are not like the others," she said. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You mean I am not scared of a woman who runs her land better than most men? She gave a small laugh, surprised. I heard what that woman said at the mercantile, he added. About you being too old. Della's mouth tightened. People like to talk. He turned toward her, voice low and even. Well, I figure if you are too old to marry, then you are just old enough for me, her breath caught. She stared at him, trying to read his face. I do not need flattery. I am not offering it, I just say what I mean. She stood, heart thudding in her chest. You should get some rest, long day tomorrow. But that night she could not sleep. The words ran through her mind like water down stone. Just old enough for me. The following days blurred together. Elias stayed past the 2 nights. He never asked, he just kept working. The roof stopped leaking. The fields were turned for spring. The children laughed more. And sometimes, when dusk fell and the sky turned lavender, Della caught Elias watching her like he was memorizing her face. One morning, Zadie came running from the woods, breathless. Ma, it is Zeke, he fell by the creek. Della dropped the bucket she was holding and ran. She found Zeke lying near the rocks, blood on his temple, crying out in pain. Elias was there a moment later. He scooped Zeke into his arms like he weighed nothing and carried him all the way back to the house. He needs stitches, Elias said, laying him on the table. I have thread in my saddlebag. Hold his hand. Della did not ask how he knew what to do. She just held her son and whispered soft things while Elias stitched the wound with steady hands. When it was done, Zeke fell asleep. Della turned to Elias, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. You are not alone anymore, Della. For the first time in years, she let herself believe it. The spring thaw came late that year, the kind that softened the hard edges of winter but left behind a mess of cold mud and swollen creeks. Della stood at the edge of the tilled field, her boots sinking just enough to remind her this land still had its weight. Elias was a few yards off, mending the last stretch of fence that bordered the property near the cottonwoods. He worked with his head down, hat shielding his face, hands sure and steady. Zadie had taken Zeke inside after his fever started to lift. Della had boiled willow bark and kept him wrapped in warm cloths, but it was Elias who sat up with him after dusk, quietly humming something low and wordless, a sound that reminded her of deep woods and river bends. She hadn't asked him to stay past the first week, and he hadn't asked to leave. You ever raise cattle? She asked as she approached, her skirt catching bits of morning dew from the grass. Drove a herd once from Abilene to Fort Benton, he said without looking up. Lost half of 'em to a river crossing, but the rest made it. You think this place could hold a few head? He straightened, eyes scanning the pasture beyond the fence. If we clear the dead brush near the ridge and dig a trough by the creek, maybe 5 or 6. Enough to trade if they're strong. I've been thinking on it, she said. We can't live on barley and eggs forever. You've been thinking further ahead lately, he said. She looked at him then, the way the years sat quiet on his shoulders, not heavy, just present. I didn't used to. Elias leaned against the post, wiping his hands on a cloth he kept in his back pocket. A place like this asks for hope, won't give it to you, just demands it. Della nodded. You ever plan to stay anywhere? I stop when it feels right. And does this feel right? He took his time answering. Getting there. Later that day, while Elias took Zeke out to teach him how to tie proper knots with scrap rope, Della walked into town. She hadn't been since the morning misses. Albright's mouth ran freely in the mercantile, but she needed seed and a new whetstone. The shop was quiet when she stepped in, save for the rustle of brown paper and the soft clink of glass jars. Mr. Haskett gave her a nod from behind the counter. Didn't see you in a while, Miss James. I've been busy, got new hands. That's so, one man, passing through, works hard. Mr. Haskett raised a brow but said nothing. She gathered what she needed and paid with coins wrapped in soft flannel. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Mrs. Albright near the bolts of calico, eyeing her over the rim of her spectacles. Still keeping company with a drifter? The woman asked, voice too sweet to be kind. Della didn't slow her step. I keep company with people who earn their place. The door creaked shut behind her. The ride back was quiet, save for the creak of leather and the wind brushing through budding cottonwood branches. When she reached the house, Zeke was asleep on a blanket under the porch awning, and Elias was working in the shed, shaping a handle for the broken hoe. She leaned against the doorway, watching his hands. "You carve," he glanced up, "only enough to keep things useful." "I used to whittle spoons. Caleb said they were too thick. They still hold stew, every time." Elias set the handle down and walked over, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "You ever think about what comes next?" "I try not to. The land decides most of it anyway." "I meant for you," she hesitated. "I'm not sure how to answer that." He stepped onto the porch beside her. "I got no land of my own, no people waiting. Just a saddle and a trail that never seems to end." Della folded her arms. "Why tell me that?" "Because I'd rather stop riding." He didn't say more. He didn't reach for her hand or try to draw her in. He just stood beside her, looking out at the farm like he already belonged to it. That evening, while the children slept and the sky turned the color of dim coals, Della brought out 2 cups of coffee, this time hot, and found Elias sitting on the rocker near the barn. She handed him one and sat on the step. "You ever think about marriage?" she asked, not looking at him. "I did once. She married someone else while I was out on a cattle run. I never asked again." "What would you ask now?" He took a sip, the steam curling around his chin. "I'd ask if a woman who's buried her past and kept a farm alive with her own hands wants a man who ain't afraid of what's real." She set her cup down. "I've been told I'm too old to marry." He turned and looked at her, his voice low but sure. "Then you're just old enough for me." She didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached over and rested her fingers on his knee, just enough. "I don't need a man to save me," she said. "I don't need saving either," he replied. They sat there until the stars came, the kind that didn't try to shine too bright, just steady, just enough to see by. The first calf was born just after sunrise, slick with afterbirth and shaking in the cold wind. Elias had been out since before light, boots and breeches soaked past the knee from checking the creek's edge. And when Della arrived with a blanket and a tin of warmed oats, she found him crouched beside the heifer, coaxing the newborn onto trembling legs. He looked up, his breath fogging in the air. "Little thing's stubborn." "She'll fit in just fine then," Della said, kneeling beside him. She handed over the oats and he fed the mother with one hand while steadying the calf with the other. His hands never rushed, even when the wind snapped sharp through the grass. Later, while Zadie mucked the chicken yard and Zeke napped on the quilt near the stove, Della ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried them out to the porch. Elias had taken to whittling in the late afternoons, not spoons or figures, but handles, tool handles mostly, made from salvaged ash and old fence posts. He was working a draw knife over a curved piece of wood when she passed him a bowl. "You ever think about building something that don't break with use?" she asked. He wiped his hands and took the bowl. "That the kind of thing you'd want," she sat beside him. "I've been thinking about adding a room to the house, something small." "Zeke's getting too long for that cot," Elias nodded. "I can draw up a plan. Might need to trade for lumber. There's a sawmill west of town near Crowley's Ford. I can ride out there next week. I've got eggs and 2 sacks of barley I can part with." He set the bowl at his feet. "You ever think about the kind of future you want for your children?" "I think about it every day." "What about for yourself?" Della looked toward the field, where the wind had laid the grass flat in patches. "I used to think I'd grow old in this house, alone. That I'd watch the roof sag and the walls lean and just keep fixing what I could, until the fixing stopped mattering." Elias didn't answer right away. He rested his forearms on his knees and stared across the yard. "I knew a man who built a house on the side of a hill, said it wasn't for shelter, it was so his wife could see the sunrise from every room. What happened to him? Flood washed it out 2 seasons later, but he built again, lower down this time. Said comfort wasn't worth much if it couldn't last." Della smiled faintly. "You always talk like you've got more than one lifetime behind you. Feels that way sometimes." That night, A storm rolled in from the west, drumming against the windows and stirring the trees like they might uproot themselves. Della lit a second lamp and checked the latch on the barn twice. When she came back inside, Elias was sitting at the table, Zeke curled in his lap, half asleep from the thunder. "He woke when the wind picked up," Elias said. "Didn't want to leave him alone. I'll take him." But Zeke had already settled, one small hand curled into Elias' shirt. Della hesitated a moment, then sat across from them, folding a dishcloth in her lap. "You're good with him." "I had a niece," Elias said softly, "back in Texas. She was 6 when I left. We used to sit under the mesquite and count birds." "I don't think she remembers me now. What made you go?" "I wasn't needed anymore. My brother remarried. His wife didn't care much for me." Della glanced at the window, where the rain ran in long, silver lines. "I think needing someone really needing them can scare folks." "Does it scare you?" "I think it used to." Elias met her gaze then, the kind of look that didn't ask for anything, just quietly waited. Zeke shifted and let out a soft sigh. "I want to build that room," Elias said. "Not just for Zeke. For whatever comes next." Della didn't speak, but she stood and crossed the space between them. She laid her hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "I'd like that," she said. The storm passed by morning, leaving the fields silvered with dew and the sky stretched clean and wide. Elias rose early to check the calf, and Della found him in the pasture, a hammer tucked into his belt and a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. He turned when he heard her steps. She made it through the night. Della looked past him to where the calf stood, legs steadier now, nosing its mother's side. "I've been thinking," she said. "If we're building a room, we ought to think about a root cellar too. The last one collapsed after Caleb passed, and I never had time to dig it out again." Elias nodded slowly. "A root cellar's a good start, a smokehouse be better for winter." "Then we'll plan both," he smiled, not wide, just enough to reach his eyes. "You say we now?" "I've been saying it a while," she said. "You just finally noticed." When they walked back to the house, their shoulders brushed once and neither stepped aside. Behind them, the sun crept up over the ridgeline, lighting the fields in soft, gold light. The sawmill near Crowley's Ford sat at the edge of a pine grove, its long, toothed blade whining faintly beneath the hands of 2 men who barely looked up when Elias and Della arrived. They'd set out before dawn, leaving Zadie and Zeke in town with the schoolteacher's wife, a stern but fair woman who'd once been a midwife back in Kansas. Della trusted her enough to leave the children for a day, though her eyes had lingered on Zeke's face longer than necessary before she'd stepped into the saddle. The ride took most of the morning. Elias led the way, his horse sure-footed even on the narrow bends where the land dropped steep beyond the trail. Della rode just behind, the wind sharp with spruce and the ground soft with needles. They didn't speak much, but it wasn't silence that pressed between them, it was ease, the kind that doesn't beg to be filled. When they reached the mill, Elias dismounted first, tying his reins to a crooked post near the water trough. Della followed, adjusting her shawl against the sudden chill that clung to the trees. "We'll need plank lengths for a 60-foot wall," she said. "And beams thick enough to hold a sleeping loft." Elias nodded once and stepped ahead, speaking quietly with the foreman, a man with a tobacco-stained beard and the eyes of someone who'd long since stopped being surprised by what people asked of him. Della waited near the wagon, watching a hawk circle above the clearing. When Elias returned, he had a slip of paper in his hand and sawdust clinging to his sleeves. "They'll cut what we need by next week. Said we can pay with half in trade grain or cured meat," he said. "He'll send a boy to collect." "That'll work," she replied. "We've got enough barley left to part with some." They offered spruce or fir. I told them fir, it'll hold up better in snow. She gave him a quick glance. "You ever build with fir before?" "Only once. Cabin near the Medicine Bow Range." Snow came early that year. Had to chisel the door open come January. "Sounds like you learned something from it." "I always do." They loaded a few smaller pieces into the wagon scrap wood the foreman offered for kindling and turned homeward by midday. The trail was muddier now, and Della kept her horse close. Near the base of a shallow draw, her mare stumbled, catching a hoof in a hidden rut. Elias was off his horse before she could call out, his hand already steadying her bridle. "You all right?" he asked, looking up at her. "Just lost her footing. I'm fine." He didn't let go until the mare had settled. Then, without a word, he stepped back and remounted. They didn't speak again until the valley opened wide below them, the sharp edge of the mountains rising like a promise beyond the fields. Della looked toward the far ridge, where the cottonwoods had begun to bud again, green edging slow into the branches. "I used to think building anything new was foolish," she said. "Like it would only remind me of what I lost." Elias didn't look at her. "And now, I think if you don't build, the land forgets you." He gave a quiet sound, not quite a laugh. "Maybe it never remembers us. Maybe we just carve something into it that lasts a little while." "I don't want to be remembered," she said. "I just want to be here while it matters." They camped that night at the edge of the lower creek, too far from home to make it back before dark. Elias started a fire, striking the flint without fuss, while Della unpacked the bread and smoked fish she'd wrapped in wax cloth. They ate without hurry, the sky deepening to a dark blue that felt heavier than night. When the meal was done, Della leaned back on her elbows, her skirts spread over the grass, eyes tracking the stars as they blinked into view. "You ever think about your people?" she asked. "Where you come from?" Elias tossed another stick onto the fire. "My father died when I was 10. Mother took in washing until her hands cracked. After that, it was just me and the road. No kin left, not the kind that looks for you." Della's voice was quiet. "You've made yourself into something steady." He looked at her then, his face caught in the firelight, lines soft and eyes unreadable. "I don't want to ride another trail alone." She didn't answer right away. She watched the sparks rise, her fingers curled into the hem of her sleeve. "I never expected to share this place again," she said. "Not really. You don't have to decide tonight, I already have." He didn't ask what she meant. He simply stood, crossed the space between them, and held out his hand. She took it. They didn't kiss, not yet. But their hands stayed joined as they settled by the fire, shadows flickering across the grass, and the silence between them folded into something whole. By morning, the frost had lifted and the path home felt different underfoot. The land hadn't changed, but something in it had opened. And neither of them spoke of the future as a question anymore. By late May, the foundation for the new room had been laid, wide planks of fir stacked neatly under canvas near the porch. The smell of fresh cut lumber clung to the air, mixing with lilac and the distant tang of creek water. Della had taken to waking before the rooster, standing barefoot on the kitchen floor, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of chicory brew as she watched Elias through the window, his back bent beneath the rising sun, hammer driving nails with a rhythm that matched her heart. He'd stopped sleeping in the barn 2 weeks back, not by request, but by quiet unfolding. One night, after Zeke's fever spiked again and Elias stayed up to cool him with damp cloths until dawn, Della had pressed a wool blanket into his arms and nodded toward the bench near the hearth. He'd stayed there since, boots tucked neatly beside her late husband's chair, bedroll folded each morning with care when the first wall rose. Zadie painted a red handprint near the baseboard with leftover barn paint. "So we remember who built it," she said, chin lifted. Della didn't stop her. That same afternoon, Elias carried the last beam to the corner post and found Della kneeling in the garden, her apron pocket lined with dry beans and onion seed. She sat back on her heels as he approached, brushing dirt from her palms. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said. Della shaded her eyes. "Out here, in town, next Sunday?" She didn't answer right away. The wind shifted, pulling the scent of pine down from the northern ridge. Then she nodded once. Sunday came clear and warm. Zadie and Zeke stayed with the schoolteacher's wife again, who'd begun baking with Zadie on quiet afternoons and let Zeke nap under her quilting frame. Della wore a dress she hadn't touched in 6 years, navy calico with a faded hem and buttons still intact. Elias didn't say a word when he saw her, but his jaw tensed slightly, the way it did when something mattered. They rode east, past the dry creek bed and the stand of cottonwoods where Caleb was buried. Elias slowed there, tugged his reins gently, but Della kept on without pause. She didn't look back. In town, Elias guided her to the edge of the cemetery where a small stone stood under a crooked pine. The name etched into it was Martha Rourke. Below that, Beloved Mother, 1815–1879. I never had a place to bring anyone before, Elias said, removing his hat. But I figure if she ever knew you, she'd have liked you. Della rested her palm on the stone, fingers tracing the first letter. You come here often? Not since the year after she passed. I didn't think I had anything left to say. She turned to him. But you brought me here. I wanted the first thing I built that lasted to mean something. She didn't speak, but she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. They stood a while longer, the breeze lifting the edge of her dress, the pine needles rustling like dry paper. That summer passed with little ceremony. The room was finished by the 3rd week of June, the root cellar dug before the heat grew too deep. Elias carved a lintel beam with the year and the initials of all 4 of them, stacked one atop the next. Zadie helped sand it smooth. Each morning brought some new task, mending the pasture gate, teaching Zeke to read a map, coaxing the stubborn heifer to nurse. And through it all, Elias remained quiet, steady, present. He never asked to stay. He simply never left. One evening, as fireflies blinked above the tall grass and the porch creaked beneath their weight, Della turned to him. I want to marry you, she said. Elias didn't answer right away. He set down the half-carved yoke he'd been shaping and turned to face her. I wasn't sure if I ought to ask, he said. You've already given me more than I ever expected. I'm not giving you anything, she said. I'm choosing, that's different. His voice was low. Then yes, I want that. I want you. They married beneath the cottonwoods, not far from where Caleb rested. Della wore a cream shawl Zadie had stitched with blue thread. Elias wore the same shirt he'd ridden in with. Reverend Gold from the next township presided, hands trembling from age but voice strong. Zeke stood beside Elias, holding a small wooden box Elias had carved to carry the ring's thin bands, hammered from a silver coin and a brass button. Zadie handed her mother a bouquet of wild lupine and sage. I reckon this is the only wedding I'll ever see that started with a busted fence and a borrowed barn, the Reverend chuckled, and Della laughed, clear and full. After the vows, they shared bread and boiled coffee with the handful of neighbors who came Mr. Haskett from the mercantile, the widow from the schoolhouse, even Mrs. Albright, who brought pickled beets and said nothing at all. Della and Elias danced once beneath the open sky, their feet slow, the children laughing nearby. No music played, just the sound of wind and the soft hush of grass beneath their boots. That night, when the house had gone quiet and the fire burned low, Della lay beside Elias in the room they'd built with their own hands. His arm was warm around her waist, his breath even against the back of her neck. He whispered her name once, like a vow. She reached for his hand beneath the quilt and held it close to her chest. Years passed. The cattle herd grew modest but strong. Zadie became a teacher, riding out each morning with ink-stained fingers and a braid down her back. Zeke grew tall and sure-footed, always with a knife in his belt and a question in his mouth. Elias built a second barn, then a smokehouse. Della planted apple trees along the western edge of the pasture, and each spring the blossoms came earlier. They never left the homestead. They never needed to. And when the wind howled in winter or the creek rose too high in spring, they faced it together, 2 people who had weathered grief, chosen hope, and built something lasting. They slept every night in a home shaped by calloused hands and quiet love, and woke each morning to the sound of a life they had made, steady and whole.